All right, welcome back to the deep dive. For this one, you guys sent in an article, and the headline is pretty wild.
Oh, yeah.
It says, Trump wakes up in a panic as he loses all control.
Wow.
So we're going to try to figure that out today, Is this just clickbait, or is there actually something more to this? Is Trump actually losing his grip on power?
It's a really dramatic headline for sure. I mean, you can't deny that, right?
Yeah,
It's trying to get your attention. But when you actually dig into the article itself, it does go a little deeper than just that headline. Like it points to some specific things that have been happening, specific events and trends that maybe suggest there's some kind of shift going on in Trump's world.
exactly, yeah. It mentions, like, the legal problems he's got piling up, and then also, like, potential setbacks he's having inside the Republican Party itself. There are even some signs that his base, supporters, might be, like, fracturing a little bit.
Right, right.
And there's this one quote that really stood out to me. It says, Trump is feeling increasingly isolated.
Hmm.
I mean, so where do we even start with all this?
Well, I think the best way to unpack all of this, the most logical way would be to break it down into three main areas.
Okay.
So first, we'll look at all those legal battles that he's got going on.
Okay.
Then we'll kind of zoom out a little bit and check out the bigger picture of politics, look at what's happening within the Republican Party and see if there's any fallout from all of this. And then finally, we'll get into, this is interesting to me at least, we'll get into the psychology of control, especially for someone like Trump, because, he's built his whole persona around this idea of control.
Okay. I like it. A three-pronged approach. All right, let's dive into that first one then. Let's start with the legal stuff. This article, it's claiming that he's facing way more serious legal trouble now than ever before. I mean, is that true? And if it is, how worried should he be, really?
Well, it's true that he's got this long history of legal battles, that's for sure. I mean, the guy's been in and out of court forever, right?
Right.
But what's different now, what makes this time different, is just how many cases there are and how serious the charges are. Like the Department of Justice, they're looking into what role he played in the January 6th events, and that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And that's different from the other investigations because this one's really trying to connect him directly to activities that might actually be, criminal.
Yeah, you're right. This isn't just another one of those lawsuits that he kind of brushes off. Like this investigation could actually end up with criminal charges. And the article also brings up those classified documents they found at Mar-a-Lago. What's the deal with that? How serious is that one?
That one's super serious. Mishandling classified documents, that gets right to the heart of national security.
Right.
So the penalties for that, if you get caught, they can be really heavy. But what's interesting about this particular case is how it might affect Trump's standing within the Republican Party. Like, if some of the big-name Republicans, if they start to see these investigations as, legitimate threats and not just some political gamesmanship, they might start to distance themselves from him. They might worry about, guilt by association.
Oh, that's a good point. It's not just about the legal consequences that he might face. It's about how these cases could impact his whole political future. And then on top of all that, the article also mentions all these other civil lawsuits that are still going on. Are those just like background noise at this point, or could those actually cause some real problems for him too?
Well, on their own, they might not seem as important as those federal investigations. That's true. But these civil suits, they could be kind of like a death by a thousand cuts situation. They're a drain on his finances, they're distracting him from everything else, and they could lead to some really damaging testimony that might be used against him in the other cases.
Ah.
And just the whole image of him being constantly tied up in legal stuff, it's not great, right? It might make the public trust him even less than they already do.
Right. That Teflon Don image he used to have, the article argues that it might be finally starting to crack.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that things might be changing within the GOP, like how the party views him. Is that really happening, or is that just like wishful thinking from his opponents?
I don't think it's just wishful thinking. There's definitely this faction within the Republican Party that's getting bigger, and they're looking for, a new direction, a future where Trump isn't the main guy anymore. And the losses in the midterms for some of the candidates that he endorsed, that definitely made this group feel more confident. And you also have these other potential challengers, guys like DeSantis, Haley, and Pence, and they're starting to kind of test the waters, see what kind of support they have, and that definitely weakens Trump's position.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what about those challengers? I mean, the article actually says there's a growing sense of buyer's remorse among some of Trump's biggest supporters. Like, they're having second thoughts. Is that division within the MAGA movement for real? Or is that just the media trying to stir things up?
No, I think it's more than just hype. He's still got his hardcore base, the people who will support him no matter what. But there are definitely these cracks starting to appear. And some of the MAGA folks, they're starting to wonder if he can actually win again, especially after those losses in the
Yeah,
midterms.
yeah.
And when you have other strong candidates like DeSantis coming up, it makes them even more unsure about Trump. It's almost like a Shakespearean drama playing out. The king, who everyone thought was invincible, is suddenly facing challenges from inside his own court.
Okay, that's a great analogy. It really captures what's going on right now. So we've got this perfect storm brewing, right? We've got the serious legal problems. We've got this potential fallout within his own party. And even some of his most loyal supporters are starting to waver. Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the psychology of control. The article says that for someone like Trump, losing control could really mess with him. Why is that?
Well, for a lot of people, feeling like they have control over their lives is super important. It
Mhm.
makes them feel stable and like they can predict what's going to happen next. But for someone like Trump, whose whole image is based on being the one in charge, the big boss,
Yeah.
the idea of losing control can be really unsettling. It can feel like a real threat.
Yeah, the article even says that for Trump, it's not just about power, it's about who he is. It quotes this psychologist who says that if Trump loses control, it would be like losing a part of himself. That's a pretty powerful statement.
It really is. I imagine how he must feel if he starts to think that all these attacks, the lawsuits, the political challenges, all the stuff the media says about him,
Uh-huh.
what if he starts to believe that it's all just an attempt to tear down who he is?
That's a scary thought. I mean, if it really is all about his identity, how far would he actually go to get that control back?
That's a really good question, and it's something we're going to explore in a lot more detail in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at how this potential loss of control might affect his actions and the decisions he makes. It could get really interesting.
Okay, I can't wait. So we were just talking about how Trump's facing all these like serious challenges legally and politically, right? But the thing that really got me thinking was what that article said about control, like the psychology of it, especially for someone like Trump, and how losing control could really affect him. I think you were about to explain how that might actually play out in real life.
Yeah. The article, it makes this point that for a guy like Trump, someone who's always been so focused on being dominant, being in control, this
Right.
idea of losing control, it's not just about losing political power. It's like a threat to his whole sense of self, to who he is.
And they quoted this psychologist in the article, and they said, for someone like Trump, who thrives on dominance and attention, losing control can be deeply unsettling. It's not just about politics, it's about identity. And that really, I don't know, it just kind of hit me.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point, and it helps to explain some of the things he's done in the past, things that seemed irrational or even self-destructive. Like when he feels like his control is being threatened, his reactions, they might not be all that strategic or calculated.
Right.
They might be driven by something deeper, by these psychological needs that he has.
Okay, so how would this play out now in this situation? Like, what kind of behavior could we expect from Trump if he's really feeling like he's losing control?
Well, one thing that people often do is just deny it. They refuse to accept what's happening.
Okay.
They cling to this belief that they're still in control, even when all the evidence points the other way.
Uh-huh.
And we've seen Trump do this a ton of times, right? He just dismisses any bad news as fake news or a witch hunt.
Yeah, that's classic Trump. But what if denial doesn't work? I mean, what else could he do?
Another possibility is that he'll lash out. When someone feels threatened or trapped, they often become more aggressive.
Right.
They start attacking whoever they see as their enemy, and they do it with more force. And we might see that happen with Trump, like in the things he says, his social media posts, maybe even in his actions. It's like, imagine a wounded lion, right?
Okay.
They get even more dangerous when they feel threatened.
So we might see even more of those crazy tweets, even more attacks on his opponents.
It's definitely possible. And another thing he might do is just double down on what he's already been doing. Stick to his old strategies.
Even if they're not working.
Yeah, even if they've already proven to be ineffective, or even if they're making things worse.
Hmm.
He might put even more energy into rallying his base, push even harder on that whole stolen election thing.
Right.
Or he might even do something more extreme just to try and grab that control back.
I'm starting to see a pattern here, like denial, getting aggressive, doubling down on stuff that's not working.
Uh-huh.
They all seem like ways to try and regain that control that he might be losing.
Exactly. And the thing that's really worrying is that those reactions, they might not be what's best for him.
Yeah.
They could actually make things worse for him, weaken his position even more.
So if he really is feeling this loss of control, his actions might not be about politics at all, but about these deeper instincts he has.
Exactly. And that makes the whole situation even harder to predict and potentially more volatile.
Okay, so if we're trying to figure out what Trump's going to do next, We can't just focus on the political stuff. We have to think about this psychological game he's playing too.
Yeah.
What are some signs, like red flags, that he's really feeling that loss of control? What should our listeners be looking out for?
I think the key is to watch for those reactions we were just talking about, denial, aggression, and doubling down. Pay attention to what he's saying, his rhetoric. Is it getting more extreme, more desperate sounding?
Okay,
And look at what he's actually doing. Is he making impulsive decisions, lashing out at people, or clinging to strategies that clearly aren't working anymore?
so it's not just about what he says, but how he says it and what he's actually doing. His whole demeanor, his tone, his reactions, those are the real clues to what's going on inside. That's really insightful.
And it's not just about Trump himself.
Right.
It's about understanding how these psychological factors can have a real impact on political events and how something that's personal can become a big political issue.
Wow, you've just given our listeners a whole new way to look at this whole drama that's unfolding.
Exactly, because in politics, just like in life, understanding the psychology of the people involved can be just as important as understanding the rules of the game.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's like a crash course in, I don't know, Trumpology or something.
It has been pretty fascinating, right? I mean, we started with that article you said it in, and look where we ended up. Legal battles, political shakeups, even psychology.
Yeah, it's crazy. And to think, it all started with that headline, Trump wakes up in a panic as he loses all control. So now that we've really dug into everything, do you think that headline was just clickbait, or is there actually something to it?
I think it's definitely more than just clickbait. I mean, Kanik might be pushing it a little, but there's no question that Trump's in a tough spot, right? Like, legally, he's facing more problems than ever before. Politically, things are shifting all around him. And then you've got that whole psychology angle, how losing control could really be messing with him.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap for our listeners and kind of pull out the main points from each section. So first, we talked about all the legal stuff. What's the biggest takeaway there?
I think it's the sheer number of cases he's facing and how serious they are. This isn't just about annoying lawsuits anymore. We're talking potential criminal charges, financial ruin, maybe even jail time. And those legal problems could spill over into his political life, too. They could hurt his chances in the future and even turn some of his supporters against him.
And then we talked about the political side of things. What stood out to you the most there?
The Republican Party is definitely at a turning point. Trump still has his loyal base, but more and more Republicans are starting to look for a new direction. Those midterms losses were a big wake-up call. And now you've got these other guys, DeSantis, Haley, Pence. They're all starting to think about running against him. It's not looking good for him.
And finally, we got into that whole psychology of control thing. What was the most important takeaway from that discussion?
Well, we have to remember that Trump doesn't always make decisions based on logic or political strategy. Sometimes it's about his own personal needs, like needing to be in control, needing to be the dominant one. And when he feels like that control is slipping away, he reacts in some pretty predictable ways, like denial, aggression, just digging his heels in even when it's not working.
So it's not just about the pressure he's facing from the outside, but also what's going on inside his own head. And that adds a whole new level of complexity to trying to understand him and his actions.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that in politics, just like in life, emotions and psychology can be just as powerful as facts and figures.
So, listeners, as you keep following this whole story, remember everything we've talked about today? What do you think? Is Trump really losing his grip on power? Or is he going to find a way to bounce back? What are the signs you're going to be watching for in the coming months?
We're still in the middle of this whole thing, right? We don't know how it's going to end. But one thing's for sure, this is a huge moment, not just for Trump, but for American politics in general. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.